The Lost Children arc is one of the most important arcs in Berserk, and the underlying theme of Lost Children might give us some key insight to the final ending of the story. The general consensus of the Lost Children arc seems to be that it is seen as filler by some casual fans, while almost all hardcore fans highly respect it. What is my opinion? The Lost Children arc is simply amazing. If you were to condense the story of Berserk into its smallest form, you would be left with the Lost Children arc. It has all the important pieces Berserk has to offer: the action, the drama, the darkness, the gore, and what is the main focus of this video, it includes and signifies one of Berserk's most important, prevalent themes, which will more than likely relate to how the story will end. And what has surprised me is that I have not seen anyone else talk about this. So what is this important theme in Lost Children? Endless suffering. That suffering is the unignorable consequence of living, and that even during the times when it seems as if things are going well and fine, there will be an impending end to it. This is a message which exceeds stories like Berserk, as it is the core theme in some religions and philosophies. An example of this from Eastern philosophy would be the first and most central noble truth of Buddha, known as Dharka, that life is unavoidably about misery and suffering. A Western philosopher who was highly impacted by these ideas was German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who pretty much transformed and interpreted these types of thoughts found in Buddhism for a European audience. In Schopenhauer's view, the world of daily life is essentially violent and frustrating. It is the world that will never resolve itself into a condition of greater tranquility. As he explicitly states, daily life is suffering. And to express this, he employs images of classical Greek mythology, such as the myth of Sisyphus, the man who was punished by being forced to push an immense boulder up a hill, only for it to roll down every time it neared the top, repeating this action for eternity. If you are a well-versed Berserk fan, you probably already know how some of the motifs in the story has been influenced by the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche and Carl Jung. But the interesting fact here is that a person who influenced both Nietzsche and Jung was none other than Arthur Schopenhauer. And speaking of Nietzsche, he is another prominent philosopher who has done his own literature on suffering. In one of his lesser-known works, How the True World Finally Became a Fable, which was a chapter in the book Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche noted how philosophers and religions in the past had divided the world into two: that we have the true world, the one that we exist in, and some form of another world. For example, according to Nietzsche, Christianity's version of this outer world was in the form of heaven, which is promoted to be a paradise. The specific criticism he had on this dichotomy was in the way he believed it to be life-denying. That thanks to this Christian heritage, especially in the West, that we had come to see the world we live in as a world which we should resent and see as suffering, a world in which we should turn away from, only to look forward and pray for entrance into the other world, or to heaven, and that in doing so, we have turned our back from life itself, in favor of myth or an imagined real world. All beings, all sentient beings in the universe, suffer. So to merely suffer is to merely be alive like any other creature. However, to make meaning from suffering is to be human. And that is how this relates to Lost Children, particularly towards the character, Jill. The Lost Children arc stands out in the way that it is one of the only arcs in the whole story where the main character is someone other than Guts. I say this because during Lost Children, the main events and circumstances unfold and revolve around Jill, not Guts. To see this theme unfold, we must first acknowledge Jill's circumstances at the beginning of Lost Children. Jill is a little girl who resides in a small village which is in a constant state of fear due to the recent attacks from the elves. On top of this, she doesn't even feel safe in her own household, as she has an abusive, alcoholic father along with a defenseless mother who gets regularly mistreated. And making things worse, her father's drinking buddies constantly try to exploit her. So all in all, she lives a life full of misery. dreading and fearing what's going to happen every day, whether it be from someone attacking her village or someone within her family. And during Lost Children, Jill is confronted with two very polarizing figures who are an anomaly from all this usual suffering, them being Guts and Rosine. Let's look at Rosine first. Linking this back to my previous point about the afterlife and paradise, Rosine is the person who encapsulates this viewpoint or ideology that there is a perfect outer world somewhere, this paradise being represented as the Misty Valley. We see Rosine express this idea through the way she tries to convince Jill to be like her and to come to the Misty Valley. In the scene after the pair had separated from Guts, when Jill had arrived to the valley for the first time, Rosine gloats about how peaceful and heavenly the Misty Valley is. She tells Jill that unlike the village they lived in, here is a place where you're never hungry or cold, how it is a secret garden just for elves, somewhere human grown-ups cannot enter, a place just for them, a place distinct and far away from the abhorrent village where Jill lives, a place where she can escape from all her usual suffering. Now, let's look at Guts. At first, it may seem strange for me to say that Guts is an anomaly or that he is someone who is distinct from all of Jill's usual suffering, as he is someone who has gone through, or is going through, a lot of suffering and struggling himself. After all, he is known literally as the struggler. But the reason why he has such an impact on Jill, and why he stood out to her, was because unlike her, he was someone who actively and independently responded against his harsh circumstances. The side of him was shown right from the first time Jill and Guts met. When Jill was helplessly taunted by the bandits after being captured, Guts appears. The group tries to intimidate him, but Guts doesn't abide by what they say, and instead he impassively attacks back. When the sacrificial tree comes to life, even though the tough-acting bandits begin to run for it, Guts holds his ground and strikes back, ultimately leading him to kill the beast. This scene evidently shows that Guts isn't someone who chooses to back down. Instead, he actively charges against whatever tries to oppose him. The side of Guts is shown over and over again, and it heavily influences Jill, because as mentioned earlier, she had always been nothing more than a victim. All her life, she had lived in a defenseless village, within an abusive household, where she was always a pushover. But through Guts, she saw someone who was an outlier compared to all the other people in the village, as someone who didn't or couldn't abide being a simple victim. Keeping these two things in mind, it shows that the conflict, or the battle between Guts and Rosine, represents these two contrasting ideologies regarding suffering clashing against each other, and the Lost Children arc itself represents Jill's dilemma between which of these two perspectives are right. The idea from Rosine being that there is such a thing as paradise, and the idea of Guts being that one must embrace and deal with suffering itself. Jill's dilemma comes to an all-time high in the episode The Misty Valley, Chapter 2. After Jill is offered by Rosine to be a part of the Misty Valley, she faces a tough predicament of whether or not she should become an elf. Although Puck is strongly against it, Jill has a hard time making up her mind. She says that back in her village, she had lived in fear all her life, and that she will continue to do so forever and ever. Jill continues by saying that even though the elves had done atrocious things, it is something that other animals do as well, and that they seem to be at peace, a state of mind which she had never experienced. But Jill's slowly impending desire to become an elf turns completely upside down in the very next scene. Jill and Puck notice something going on and look over. They see the other children preparing to play war, and Jill comments, "It looks so real." Suddenly, the group starts mercilessly massacring each other. One of them says, "Only humans can enjoy killing like that. Only humans, or else, monsters." After seeing such a horrific sight, Jill runs for it and eventually meets Rosine again. She confronts that what they were doing was wrong, that they died, that it's killing your own friends. To this, Rosine says back, they were only playing human, that war is something which happens between humans as well, and that there are plenty of other bad things within humans, and that all the fun is outside the village, in the forest or in the river. All of this comes crashing down on Jill, because all this time, she thought the Misty Valley was exempt from all these atrocities and negative human qualities, that the valley was a peaceful place where everyone has fun, exempt from all the usual suffering she endured. But she learns the truth that those things exist even here, and probably even to a much higher degree. Jill slowly starts to become enveloped by the web, but due to Puck's clumsiness, Rosine accidentally cuts one of the other cocoons, which drops the premature body of one of the children. This completely terrifies Jill, which wakes her up again. But suddenly, the pair notice the cocoons are on fire, and they notice something in the distance. As mentioned earlier, this fight between Guts and Rosine represents the two contrasting perspectives on suffering clashing against each other. For example, Guts burning down the Misty Valley is a metaphor of him giving Jill and Rosine a reality check, that there is no such thing as paradise, and that even if there appeared to be, it is sure to burn down eventually, only leaving one back to where they started. And Guts fully encapsulates his viewpoint even more through his outward demeanor. After struggling with himself to swing a sword around the children, Guts tries to completely alter himself by attempting to ignore and block out all his emotions towards others. As even Jill says, for an instant, swaying inside the blaze, he was the one who looked more like a terrifying monster to me. She also notes that a forest ghost would be considered gentle compared to him. And it's only fitting that both the vital blows that Guts landed on Rosine were only done in a way Guts took a whole heap of damage himself. What deepens Guts' perspective on suffering even more is the way Rosine actually knew she was wrong to begin with. When she begins falling from the sky after being defeated, she has a flashback. Rosine says, "No, they weren't there. I waited for days and days. I waited forever. I'd known it. I hadn't really believed in them. In silly elves." When she finally does drop to the ground, she tells Jill in her last breath, "They weren't there. There weren't really any elves. I waited alone, day after day, but no elves appeared. There were never any such things. Peekith and the elves of the Misty Valley were just fairy tales that some lonely child made up. I'm sure." In her final moments, she spreads her wings one last time to fly. She says she has to go home, that she must go home now. The sun's gone down, and the moon's already so high. Since Rosine admitted to herself that there was no escape from all her suffering, she says she has to go back home, back to where she came from, but there is no home anymore. As Jill says herself, Rosine's flown off for home, almost like Peekith, running back to his house. She perfectly verbalizes the path that Rosine was on the whole time, a road she will never reach the end of. And now we move on to what might just be my favourite scene in all of Berserk. As Guts stands in the shadows, Jill begs him to take her with him, to take her somewhere, as long as it's not here. Since she now knows that Rosine's beliefs were wrong, Jill sees Guts as the only way out of all the usual misery she goes through. But Guts says back, "Take a good look around us, a good hard look at the shadows, at the darkness around me." He tells her that the darkness itself is what she is looking for, and that in the end, there's no paradise for her to escape to. All in all, what Guts is saying here is that there is no way out of all of this misery, that even if you were to get out of suffering, it will only be temporary, and that eventually, all you will be met with would be another battlefield, where the same terrible things await. When Guts turns his back on her, Jill begs again, but Guts simply says back, Go back. Back to your battlefield. The preceding scene is when Jill's dilemma is resolved. She tells Puck, "I guess I don't think I can be violent like the swordsman after all. And I guess I really don't have the courage to run away like Rosiden did. But at least, I think I'll try crying and shouting and biting my way through. Maybe I can change something." The two part ways, and the final page shows the words, "In a tiny village, nestled in a ravine, difficult to see even from the ear. I think I'm about to start my own battle." Here, Jill fully acknowledges both ideologies, and while she says herself that she can't be violent like Guts, she says she isn't going to try and escape either. That instead, she will try to actively change something within her own control, and that she will start her own battle. Jill's battle might not be as important and over the top as Guts' battles, but it will still be a battle nonetheless. So in the end, Guts' philosophy wins. So how does this hint the ending of Berserk? This continual theme of endless suffering, that there is no happy finishing line, that even when things seem to be at peace, that misery will resurface again, is a theme which is shown not just in Lost Children, but in all of Berserk. In the Golden Age arc, Griffith's downfall showed exactly this. After the band had won the 100-Year War, Guts and the crew had supposedly made it, but as we all know, this all comes crashing down soon afterwards. Even in one of the more recent chapters, chapter 359, Guts and his friends had finally made it to Elfhelm, and Casca's memory had finally been restored after such a long, hard journey. But all of this turns completely upside down in the way Guts couldn't actually face Casca. All of this shows that at the end of Guts' journey, he will not be met with some tranquil fate. Does this mean we are 100% going to have a bad or unsatisfying ending? Absolutely not. This just means that Berserk is sure not to have some easygoing finale. Instead, Guts will be confronted with some other challenge, one way or another, and whether Guts does get his revenge or not, he will more than likely face the fact that killing Griffith will not actually change anything, that it won't bring back his fallen comrades, and that some other issue, whether it be big or small, will take its place.